Hello again. In my last video, I discussed some of the most wholesome SCPs in existence, and I feel like it's only fair now that I've lifted your spirits to bring them crashing back down with some of the saddest SCPs out there. Before I begin, I'd like to apologize if my voice is at all stuffy or hoarse, as I am still recovering from a sickness that I got over the weekend. We'll start with SCP-1230, titled A Hero is Born. SCP-1230 is a safe class object which is stored in a secure storage locker located behind the desk of SCP-Site-12's main library. It is an unlabeled green hardcover book which is blank with the exception of its first page, which reads, A Hero is Born. Upon first glance, the book appears to be perfectly ordinary. However, once a reader has fallen asleep, they will dream that they are in a fantasy world where they are the protagonist of a troubled land. Their senses, touch, hearing, smell, taste, and sight, work just as well in this dream world as they do when the reader is awake. In these dreams, there is always a character known as the Bookkeeper, who appears as a bearded man in a green cloak and claims to be the personification of SCP-1230 himself. And he both creates the fantasies and helps the dreamers to live them out, while expressing sorrow when the dream comes to an end, asking the dreamers to come back soon. Time works differently inside the dream world, as we'll soon discover, and 24 hours in our world can feel like 200 years there. However, the reader will usually remain asleep only as long as they would normally, so this isn't typically a problem, with one major exception, which we'll get to now. There was an SCP professor who was an avid fan of role-playing and tabletop games, and so, as you can imagine, he was quite excited about the prospect of using SCP-1230. The experiment began as it normally would, with the professor sitting down, opening the book, and quickly falling asleep. But staff members started to get alarmed when 15 hours had passed and the professor was still asleep. On-site medical staff were able to confirm that he was alive, but he wouldn't wake up for another 9 hours, and when he finally did wake up, he seemed deeply confused, even asking, "Where am I?" at one point before regaining his memory. At this point, the professor excuses himself to use the restroom, and after a full day of sleeping, I doubt anyone thought that it was unusual. However, 15 minutes had passed and he still hadn't returned, so a nurse entered to check on him and found that he had hung himself. His final message, "I can't go back to this," was written on the wall. Later, SCP-1230 was examined, and all of its pages were found to be soaking wet with the same written thing on each page. "I'm so sorry, I never intended for this to happen. I just wanted to make people happy," over and over again. The bookkeeper was consulted about what happened in the professor's dream later, and he revealed that the professor fell in love with the dream world. He conquered foul beasts, built up great kingdoms, and even raised a family, but he disconnected himself from reality and rejected the bookkeeper when he told him that it was all just an illusion, threatening to end his life if he was ever forced to leave. The bookkeeper kept him in the dream as long as he possibly could, but eventually we all have to wake up, and the professor was no different. The story does have a somewhat happy ending. An SCP doctor gave the SCP a small note which contained, quote, "just some friendly advice," and a few days later the book returned to normal. But the professor's story is a tragic reminder that we're not just hurting ourselves when we engage in self-harm. Everyone around us, including Magic Green bookkeepers in this case and our loved ones in real life, are also affected. Next, we'll discuss an SCP which, unfortunately, doesn't have a happy ending. In fact, it doesn't really have an ending at all. SCP-145, titled Man-Absorbing Phone. SCP-145 is a Euclid-class object, which appears to be a kind of cordless telephone, which rings constantly, regardless of a lack of power. When the phone is answered, a female voice can be heard speaking in a voice that shows high levels of stress and panic. She pleads with the listener to help her as she describes instances of torture being conducted on unknown victims. The torture can be heard in the background. Attempts to trace the call or track down the caller's location have proven unsuccessful. Attempts to block the signal of the phone have also proved unsuccessful. Subjects who have attempted to answer the call without live supervision will vanish mysteriously, and it's been discovered that they join the group of tortured individuals. The Foundation has attempted to send callers armed with knives, guns, and even a C4 explosive, but all it has done is waste their resources, as none of these heroic attempts have been successful in saving the victims. I can only imagine what it must be like to possess such an SCP, to know that there are people who need your help desperately, but are just out of your reach. At this time, the Foundation has suspended all testing of SCP-145. Finally, we're going to discuss SCP-085, titled Hand-Drawn Cassie. SCP-085 is a safe class object, and it is the result of an experiment conducted using SCP-067, the artist's pen, and SCP-914, the clockworks, which I will perhaps cover in another video. SCP-085 is a drawing of a female human named Cassandra. She is completely sentient and prefers to be called Cassie. She is able to interact with any object drawn on the same page as her. For example, if someone were to draw her a Jeep, she could drive it as if it were real. Besides animals and people, any drawn object becomes animated when in contact with SCP-085, and ceases to be animated as soon as she breaks that contact. She also has the ability to transfer herself to any image or sheet as long as it is flush with the one that she is currently on. However, she is unable to transfer herself to anything besides paper or canvas at this time. When she transfers herself to a new piece of art, she adopts the artistic style of her new environment, whether it's watercolor or oil paintings or manga. In comic form, her voice is visible as thought and voice bubbles which appear around her head. Otherwise, she communicates by writing text on the paper she exists on. Now that I've painted this picture of what appears to be a wholesome SCP, it's time to get to the sad part. SCP-085 was not always aware of her status as a 2D object. The Foundation attempted, for a time, to present SCP-085 with a scenario in which she was the last survivor of an apocalypse and was searching for other survivors. That all changed when a researcher accidentally left a copy of SCP-085's file lying next to the paper she was on. She transferred herself to her file and immediately became aware of her true nature. Researchers immediately advocated for her termination. Whether that was for her sake or not is unclear, but SCP-05 Council voted to allow her to live on. Since discovering what she truly is, SCP-085 has begun to show signs of severe depression. After all, she now not only knows that she is alone, but she's also aware of the fact that experiments attempting to create another being like her have all failed. Unfortunately, that's where her story comes to an end, at least for now, alone and without any hope of not being alone. The good news, though, is that the SCP universe has no current canon. If you want to believe that the tortured victims of SCP-145 are eventually saved, you can do that. If you want to believe that someone, somewhere, finds a way to be with SCP-085, you can. The best thing about rock bottom is there's only one way to go, and that's up. Well, that's not exactly true, but you get the message. At any rate, thanks for watching. Please consider subscribing, liking, and commenting if you enjoy this content, and I'll see you next time in another video.